Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 158, Napoleon of the Old Man Plain, Part 2. This episode is covering the rest of the children of Frank and Emily Falkiner, starting with their firstborn son. The sixth child, Frank Brereton Sadler Falkiner, was born on the 17th of June 1867 in Ararat. He was the eldest boy in the family. His younger brother Otway would later rival him as a merino sheep breeder. Frank was educated at the Geelong Church of England Grammar School. Frank managed the family properties for some time, and in 1909 he became the managing director of F.S. Falkiner and Sons on the death of his father. He married Ethel Elizabeth Howard on the 5th of May 1902 in Ararat when he was 34 and Ethel 22. The announcement in the papers of the marriage of Frank Brereton Sadler, Tupple, New South Wales, eldest son of F.S. Falkiner of Bunnock, and Ethel, eldest daughter of Mr. George Howard of Cumnock, Royal Park, took place at Melbourne Scots Church. They had 2 sons and 2 daughters. He left real and personal property of £90,000 and a finding of accidental death was recorded. Frank was also a founding member of the Conago Shire Council, which was formed in 1906, and his political interests were awakened by the 1910 federal land tax, which prompted him to enter the Australian House of Representatives. He won the seat of Riverina in 1913, representing the Liberal Party, but lost it to former member John Chanter the following year. He won Hume in 1917 for the Nationalist Party, but was defeated in his attempt to transfer to the Senate in 1919. He was a brusque and humorous politician, and Falkiner derided Labor Prime Minister Andrew Fisher's 1912 maternity allowance as a bangle bonus. He was described in the Australian Dictionary of Biography as a large man, balding with a bristling moustache, and he was an impatient parliamentarian. On his departure from politics, Falkiner concentrated on breeding sheep. He was president of the Southern Riverina Pastoralists Union, one of the founders of the Australian Stud Merino Flock Register, and director of Bank of New South Wales from 1919 to 1929. Frank Falkiner died on the 30th of October 1929 at Foxlow Station, Bungendore, of a stroke, and was survived by his wife, his 2 sons and 2 daughters. And the Deniliquin Independent had an obituary of Frank. Mr. Frank B.S. Falkiner, one of the most prominent graziers and breeders in this state, died after a short illness at his well-known Queanbeyan station, Foxlow, last week. He was 62. Born at Ararat, Mr. Falkiner was the eldest son of Mr. F.S. Falkiner, a prominent Riverina pioneer of the Bunnock stud fame. At the age of 17, he assumed control of Moonbury Station and later became manager of Tupple Station. This property consisted of 170,000 acres, carrying upwards of 200,000 sheep. He remained at Tupple for nearly 20 years until the property was sold. It was largely owing to his activities that the state government resumed 50,000 acres of Tupple Estate, the settlement of which made the town of Finley the centre of an important wheat-growing district. Later he became owner of the famous Haddon-rigged stud sheep station at Warren and the Foxlow cattle station. During the war, he was one of the growers' representatives on the Central Wool Committee, where he did splendid work. The president of the Graziers Association said the pastoral industry was the poorer by the death of Mr. F.B.S. Falkiner. For many years, in many ways, he had rendered distinguished service. His work, for example, as a representative of the growers in the Central Wool Council, which controlled all of Australia's wool during the war years, was warmly appreciated by the growers. Born and bred in the pastoral industry, Mr. Falkiner was one of the industry's outstanding personalities. There probably was no greater authority in Australia on stud sheep breeding. He was an intensely practical pastoralist, and his advice was keenly sought after and always willingly given. He knew every phase of the industry, and he was an original thinker. He had the good of the industry at heart, and I'm sure the news of his death will come as a shock to graziers throughout the Commonwealth. For myself, I have lost a real friend. He has 2 sons, George and Richard Falkiner of Sydney, and 2 daughters, Miss Enid Falkiner, who is in London, and Mrs. James Lowry of New Zealand. And his wife, Elizabeth Elsie Falkiner, died on the 18th of October 1946. It stated that she was a wealthy property owner and was found dead in her sumptuous Bellevue Hill mansion on early Friday morning. She had been smothered. Mrs. Falkiner was found lying face downwards on her bed by her housekeeper, and it is believed she had been dead for 24 hours. The deceased had extensive property in the Riverina and around Canberra. Early indications are that the woman collapsed and thus smothering herself. Their firstborn child was Enid Baisley Howard Falkiner. She was born in 1903 in Elstonwick in Victoria. She was residing with her parents at Bellevue Hill in New South Wales in 1930 at the age of 27, and then she married Eric Montague Nelson at Wallara on the 28th of January 1931 when she was 28 and Eric 25. They had 3 children, 2 of whom survived childhood. In 1966 she was living at Havelock North, New Zealand, and she died on the 20th of May 1989 in Cairns, Queensland, with her usual residence of Sydney at the age of 86. Lucy Frances Falkiner was born in 1905. She married James North Lowry in 1926. It says a wedding of interest to New Zealand took place in Sydney recently with Miss Lucy Frances Falkiner, second daughter of Mr. and Mrs. F.B.S. Falkiner of Bellevue Hill, and Mr. James North Lowry, son of Mr. and Mrs. T.H. Lowry of Okoa Station, Hawke's Bay, New Zealand. And upon their mother's death, there was an article in the New Zealand papers, New Zealand legatees. A fortune of £97,656 was left by a Mrs. Elizabeth Ethel Falkiner, 65, a widow of Bellevue Hill, Sydney, and a member of the well-known New South Wales grazing family who died in 1946. Except for minor legacies, the whole of the estate was left to her 2 daughters, Mrs. Lucy Frances Lowry, wife of the well-known New Zealand grazier, and Enid Baisley Howard Nelson. George Brereton Falkiner was born on the 12th of February 1907 at Royal Park, Melbourne. He was educated at the Geelong Church of England Grammar School and then St Paul's College and then the University of Sydney, where he specialised in engineering technology. When his father died in 1929, he took over Haddon Rig, an 82,000-acre property near Warren. In 1930, he gained a pilot's licence. After experiencing drought, debt and depression, by the late 1930s, he'd spent £45,000 on improvements, including an airstrip, and Haddon Rig was operating profitably. Returning from the US after the outbreak of World War II, Falkiner set up and was chairman of Turner Parachute Proprietary Limited, which made 25,000 parachutes for dropping supplies into New Guinea. He was also chairman of the York Air Conditioning and Refrigeration Australia-Asia Proprietary Limited, which delivered defence equipment worth nearly £1 million. He was twice rejected in 1941 for the Royal Australian Air Force because of deafness. He voluntarily flew for the Allied Works Council and in connection with the anti-aircraft defences of Sydney. He was a ready innovator and was fascinated by technology, and he took a keen practical interest in a wide range of activities, including rainmaking experiments, firefighting equipment, soil conservation, artificial stock insemination, and the scientific measurement of wool. He was one of the first studmasters to employ a resident veterinarian. An expert pilot and winner of numerous flying trophies, he was a pioneer of rural air transport and from 1946 sent his Rams by air to the Sydney sales. He had an office in Sydney, in addition to 6 company directorships, among them the clothing firm Scamp Proprietary Limited. He ran an import-export business in partnership with his friend Clive Corbell, a wartime flying ace. On the 2nd of June 1949 at the King's Chapel of St John the Baptist in Savoy, London, Falkiner married Pauline Arnold Weir, a well-known equestrian from Bowning. He was 42 and Pauline 27 when they married. In 1954, he gave £50,000 to the University of Sydney to establish a nuclear research laboratory in memory of his father. George Falkiner was governor of the university's Nuclear Research Foundation, and in 1955 he received an honorary doctorate in science. He was a spokesman, writer and publicist for the wool industry, and Falkiner travelled throughout the world studying the latest developments. He gave money to support wool research and promotion and strongly opposed the ban on the export of merino rams and advocated that Australian wool should be marketed abroad under a distinctive trade name. He was council member, president and life member of the New South Wales Sheepbreeders Association. In 1959 he helped to found and was first president of the Australian Association of Stud Merino Breeders. That year he gave 70 stud rams to soldier settlers. He was enterprising and progressively thinking, and he made Haddon Rig a cornerstone of the Australian wool industry and the most famous medium-strong wool merino stud in the world. In 1960, Haddon Rig topped the aggregate at the Sydney ram sales for the 20th successive year, and 2 rams sold for £7,350 and £8,715, which set world record prices. By the 1960s, Haddon Rig blood accounted for 35% of Australian merinos. He was short and stocky, outwardly serious, but had a good sense of humour. He was known by his friends as GBS and enjoyed a flamboyant social life. In addition to the Australian Jockey, Sydney Turf and sundry picnic race clubs, he belonged to the Australian University and Royal Sydney Golf Clubs and the Royal Aero Club of New South Wales. They had 2 daughters, and at the time of his death, they had a 6-year-old son, and he died of cancer on the 16th of October 1961 in the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital in Sydney. His ashes were scattered at Haddon Rig. His estate was sworn in for probate at £766,629. As he willed, his pastoral interests were carried on by his executors of the company, with his wife as a general supervisor until their son attained the age of 23. His youngest child, Frank Brereton Sadler Falkiner, known as Richard, was born in 1909 in North Carlton. He married Sheila Muriel Skerritt on the 14th of May 1934 at Wallara in New South Wales, and they had 1 son. Frank Jr. died at the age of only 32 on the 19th of December 1941 at Potts Point as a result of being knocked down by a motor vehicle in a semi-blacked out section of the road. And the small article states Grazier's death during blackout. How Frank Brereton Sadler Falkiner, known as Richard Falkiner, 33, Grazier of Elizabeth Bay, was killed in a partial blackout in December was told at the Coroner's Court today. He was wearing a dark suit when he walked across Macleay Street, King's Cross, with Lieutenant Commandeer A.G. Lewis to visit his wife in hospital and was struck by a car. The 7th child of Frank Falkiner was Ethel Beatrice Falkiner. She was born in 1870 in Ararat. She married Henry Lane Wilkinson in December 1900 in Windsor, Victoria, when she was 30 and Henry 41. They had a daughter, Elizabeth, who died as an infant. Henry Wilkinson was a solicitor, and he'd been born in Sydney. He was the son of the late ex-judge William Hatton and Elizabeth Jane Wilkinson, both of Sydney. He was educated at Sydney Grammar School and Sydney University. He commenced his career in Sydney and then acted as an associate to Justice Harding in Queensland. He then returned to Sydney, passed his exams and commenced practice in Bowen, Queensland. He later opened an office in Broken Hill and then commenced practice in Deniliquin, which office he retained until he retired in 1923. He was a councillor on the Deniliquin Shire Council and was mayor in 1906. And Ethel died on the 2nd of April 1933 in Melbourne, aged 63. The 8th child, Norman Fraser Falkiner, was born on the 11th of November 1872 in Ararat. He married Mary Louisa Smithwick, known as Maidie, on the 18th of April 1901 in Athey, Ireland. They had 8 children. He was a grazier, but they resided in Melbourne, and Norman died on the 11th of May 1929 at Brookwood, London, England. And the announcement of his death was in the Jerilderie Herald and Urana Advertiser. Death of Mr. Norman Falkiner. The death is announced of Mr. Norman Fraser Falkiner, member of the Legislative Council of Victoria and one of the well-known family of Riverina pastoralists. Mr. Falkiner left Melbourne on the Mongolia on March the 26th, intending to go on to Germany to consult a medical specialist. He'd undergone several operations in Melbourne at private hospitals before deciding to go abroad. His condition became worse on the steamer, and immediately upon his arrival he entered into a nursing home. Mr. Falkiner was aged 56. He was born in 1872 and was educated at Geelong Grammar School. He and his brothers have left an enduring memorial of their gratitude to their old school in the form of a chapel, which they recently caused to be erected on the grounds of the Geelong Grammar School at the cost of £16,000. After leaving school, Mr. Falkiner went into the pastoral industry as manager of his father's station, Moonbury, near Jerilderie. He later managed Moira and Bunnocknor, then known as Widgewa. Mr. Falkiner then bought Tupple Station, which he afterwards sold to Ben Chafee, and finally purchased Nurillum, which he owned until his death. Apart from breeding racehorses and merinos, Mr. Falkiner was also interested in Clydesdale horses, shorthorn cattle, and Border Leicester sheep, and animals from his studs were always eagerly sought by purchasers. He was fond of sport and the outdoor life, and he possessed a nature that endeared him to a wide circle of friends that will deeply mourn his death. Until last year, Mr. Falkiner had never taken an active part in public affairs. He then stood as the Nationalist candidate for the Melbourne South Province in the Legislative Council and was easily able to defeat the Labor candidate. Mr Falkiner was known to racing men as the owner of the famous Narillum stud in the Goulburn Valley and as the owner of a great many racehorses. At Narillum, Mr Falkiner bred some of the best horses that have ever raced in Australia. Mr Falkiner married Mary Louise Smithwick, the only daughter of Canon Smithwick of Monasterevin, County Kildare, Ireland, and there are 7 surviving children: Mrs Blakeney, wife of Captain Blakeney of the Indian Army, Nancy, Standish, Marjorie, Tempe, Elizabeth and Norman. Norman and Mary's firstborn, Mary Alice Falkiner, known as Molly, married Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Richard St Ledger Blakeney in Bengal, India at the Christchurch on the 8th of March 1923, when Mary was 21 and Stephen 25. They spent 20 years in India and then they returned to live in Victoria. Mary died in Armidale, Victoria on the 2nd of October 1964 at the age of 62. They had no children. Their second child, Nancy Louisa Falkiner, was born on the 22nd of March 1906 in St Kilda. She went to London when she was 21 and married Keith John MacDonald in 1943 in Victoria. The article in the Melbourne Sun News Pictorial said uniforms were worn by the bride and bridegroom at the marriage of Private Nancy Falkiner, AWAS, to Corporal Keith MacDonald, celebrated at St Silas's Church, Albert Park. The bride is the second daughter of the late Mr Norman Falkiner and Mrs Falkiner of Toorak Road, Toorak. The bridegroom is the only son of Mr R MacDonald of Maryborough and the late Mrs MacDonald. Nancy was 37 when they married. They had no children. She died on the 21st of June 1956 in Malvern, Victoria at the age of 50. The third child was Richard Standish Falkiner, who was born on the 27th of November 1908 in South Yarra. He married Velda Mendez at the Christchurch, South Yarra on the 20th of December 1938 when he was 30 and Velda 27. They had 2 daughters. Richard was a grazier who owned Pakara at Darlington, Victoria. In November 1929, his father's estate was announced with a total of £219,800. It said that Mr Falkiner died on the 11th of May and his will, dated on March 19, 1929, had his executors and trustees as his widow, Mary Louisa Falkiner, and his brothers Otway and Lee, and his son Frank Norman Falkiner. To his widow he gives all articles of household, domestic and personal, and a legacy of £1,000. The trustees are directed to hold the residue upon trust as to 1/2 part of such of his sons who attain 21 years, in such shares that the share of his son, Richard Standish Falkiner, shall be less than the share of any other son by £10,000, and as to the other 1/2 part for his daughters who attain 21 years or previously marry in equal shares. Mr Falkiner explains that his reason for reducing the share of his son, Richard Standish Falkiner, is that the latter has already received benefits in excess of those received by the other children. Says the share bequeathed to Richard Standish Falkiner and the income thereof shall not vest absolutely in him but be placed in trust. If he marries with the consent of the trustees, they may think fit to either pay the income to his widow in maintaining and educating the children to the satisfaction of the trustees. After the death of the widow, the share can be bequeathed to the children of Richard Standish Falkiner once they attain the age of 21 years. If there is no child, this share is to be added to the shares settled upon to the testator's daughters, so Richard's sisters. In the event of his son Richard marrying without the consent of the trustees, the latter are directed to pay the whole or any less part of the income for the maintenance and personal support or benefit of Richard Standish Falkiner and his wife and children in such proportions as they may think proper, and after his death they are instructed to hold the trust money as an accretion to equal parts to the respective shares settled upon the testator's daughters. So his father effectively removed Richard from the will, and the only way that he's going to have any claim on the will is if he has children that can claim it at that point. And Richard died in 1973 in Toorak at the age of 65. The next child was Marjorie Medford Falkiner, known as Mamie. She was born in Armidale in 1910 and married John Hamilton Fitz on the 30th of November 1932 at the Christchurch, South Yarra. She was 22 and John 30. John was an accountant and they had a son and a daughter. Marjorie died on the 10th of May 1973 in Toorak at the age of 63. Emily Falkiner was born in 1911 in Armidale. She married Jack Stanley Hughes de Seville in Victoria in 1935. And the title of the article when they married said, "Daughter of one of Melbourne's best-known families weds." Emily and Jack divorced in June 1947. She was 35 and he was 42 at the time of their divorce, and they had no children. Emily died on the 15th of March 1969 in Brighton, Victoria, at the age of 58. The next child was Tempe Margaret Falkiner, who was born in 1913 in Armidale, Victoria. She married Hal William Watt in 1934 in Victoria at the age of 21. They had 3 daughters, and Tempe died on the 5th of December 1994 in Toorak at the age of 81. And their youngest child, Frank Norman Falkiner, was born on the 14th of May 1917 in Armidale in Victoria. He went to London when he was 17 and returned back to Australia when he was 21 on the 12th of May 1939. He was a clerk living at South Yarra, and he enlisted in World War II in 1943. He was discharged on the 17th of November 1945. He married Gladys Morris prior to his enlistment. They had 2 sons. And he died on the 21st of March 2004 in Toorak at the age of 86. It stated that his occupation at the time of his death was a stockbroker. The 9th child of Frank and Emily Falkiner was Otway Rothwell Falkiner, and he was born on the 16th of December 1875 at Ararat. He married Mary Elizabeth McLaurin, known as Sissy, in Deniliquin on the 14th of June 1899, and they had 3 children. He was the director of F.S. Falkiner and Sons, and he ran Wanganella and Bunnock. He was a member of Parliament from April 1946. Sissy died in 1909, the year her youngest child, Otway, was born. And the Riverine Herald outlined this. Mrs. Otway Falkiner, it is with great regret that we have to record the death of Mrs. Otway Falkiner of Paracuta Station, which sad event took place in Melbourne. The deceased lady was the daughter of Mr. James McLaurin of Morocco Station, Deniliquin, and was highly respected throughout the district. Of a charitable and kindly disposition, any movement for the alleviation of distress or trouble ever met with ready support from the late Mrs. Falkiner. For some time past, the deceased lady's health had caused considerable uneasiness to her husband and relatives, and a trip taken to England and the continent last year would, it was hoped, completely restore her to robustness. An unfortunate cold contracted a few weeks ago laid the Mrs. Falkiner up, and pleurisy supervening led to a regrettable result. The remains were brought for interment at the Echuca Cemetery by special train. It was one of the most lengthy witnessed in Echuca for many years and was attended by all representative people in the town and district, many coming 20 or 30 miles over bad roads to be present. Last night a special service was held at St James's Church of England, Moama, to the memory of the deceased lady. The church was draped in full mourning and special hymns sung. At the close of the service, the Dead March in Saul was rendered by the organist, during which the congregation remained standing. And the priest said, "Since last Sunday, another has been called home in the person of the late Mrs. Falkiner, and truly hers was a life which all of us will remember for her kind and gentle courtesy, which was extended to all with whom she came into contact. While her position was a leading one in the district, each and all in her presence felt the result of the influence of a kind and sympathetic nature. Outside her home circle, the poor with whom she came in contact with will be the first to realise a tremendous loss, for many of us know that in the direction of the late Mrs. Falkiner, in many cases personally, ministered where the needs of others were concerned. Outside her home circle, the deceased lady was ever ready to respond to the calls made upon her in the interests of the church. It is not a year since the late Mrs. Falkiner took a leading part, both from a pecuniary and personal standpoint, in a large sale of work here, which proved to be the means of financing this church in the hour of its direct need. Nor was this all. She was one of the most willing and liberal supporters here in the interests of foreign work. Although she is no longer with us, surely her work follows her and will live after her here. Otway then married Una Caroline Lessuif on the 10th of November 1910 in Toorak when he was 35 and Una 29. In the Deniliquin Pastoral Times on the 26th of November 1910, the marriage was announced. The marriage of Mr. Otway Falkiner of Bunnock and Miss Vera Lessuif was quietly celebrated at St John's Church, Toorak. Only relatives of the bride and bridegroom were invited. The bride entered with her brother, Mr. Dudley Lesouv, the present director of the Melbourne Zoological Gardens. After their honeymoon, they'll return to live at Bunnock, the homestead that has become historic in consequence of the great success achieved there by the late Mr. F.S. Falkiner. They had 3 children together. Only one daughter survived, though. One daughter died at 2 years old, and their son died in World War II as a member of the RAAF in England, aged only 24. In 1934, Otway tested an idea he'd been developing, utilising 13 sports which had no horns from the Bunnock drop of nearly 9,000 rams. From the 13, Otway selected 8 to put over 400 Bunnock ewes the following year, thus beginning the Pole Bunnock stud. Otway considered that the hornless merino had several advantages. They were quicker to mature, withstood drought better, and had fewer losses from horns being caught in fences, and without the weight of the horns were able to search further for feed. The first offering of Pole Bunnock rams to the public was in 1937. In the period of 1909 to 1954, Otway oversaw the sale of 320,000 rams, and in 1958 was responsible for the reuniting of the Pepin properties and sheep under one ownership of F.S. Falkiner and Sons, purchasing Wanganella from Austin. It is claimed that 80% of the sheep studs in Australia are connected to the Bunnock bloodline. Mr. Falkiner was described as grey-haired, 15 stone and unmistakable in his Bunnock tartan tie, which was especially manufactured for him from Bunnock wool. In April 1961, at Otway's last public appearance, W.A. Chafee, the deputy leader of the Country Party in New South Wales, referred to Otway as the daddy of them all, and said that history will record the great debt that Australia owes to Mr. Falkiner for not only holding these studs together, but also developing them to the extent that today these bloodlines are to be found in probably 95% of the merino sheep throughout Australia. On the 23rd of October 1961, at the age of 88, Otway Falkiner died in his sleep at Bunnock. By 1967, the remaining Falkiner family were considering selling out, and it was in 1971 that Cleckheaton, headed up by Frederick James, purchased all the issued capital of F.S. Falkiner and Sons Proprietary Limited. Cleckheaton put Alec Morrison as studmaster and Bob Sefton as general manager in charge of the business. Within 2 years, Cleckheaton was enjoying a strong wool market at the end of the drought and had spectacular ram sales. However, by late 1977, the property was again in drought and they were again on the market, and there was a real possibility that the Falkiner studs might be split up. In March 1978, Rupert Murdoch's News Limited acquired F.S. Falkiner and Sons as a whole, keeping everything together. Rupert Murdoch said, "We have confidence in the present management of the company and we look forward to the continuation of the existing successful policy in developing the best possible sheep." The News Limited reign concluded in June 2000 when Bell Commodities acquired F.S. Falkiner and Sons and continued their long involvement in the pastoral industry. Otway's first child with Sissy McLaurin was Charles Leslie Sadleir Falkiner. He was born on the 14th of December 1900 in North Carlton. He married Irene Ida Forsyth in Wallara in 1924 when he was 24 and Irene 23. Charles enlisted in World War II in the RAAF and he was discharged on the 6th of August 1945 with his rank as Flight Lieutenant. Charles ran the Wanganella estate and another property, Zara, out at Wanganella. His wife Irene died on the 5th of September 1947 in Orange, and he went on to marry Mary Evelyn Keel, known as Molly, in 1948 in Sydney. He then went on to own and manage Bunnock North, and he died in Wagga on the 2nd of July 1960, aged 59. And his death was outlined in the paper. Mr. Charles Leslie Sadleir Falkiner, a member of one of Australia's best-known pastoral families, died in hospital in Wagga on Saturday. He always lived in the Riverina and ran merino stud properties at Widgewa and Conago. A leading Riverina racehorse owner, his best-known racehorse was the 1958 Moonee Valley Cup winner Humber Hawk, which is now at stud at Bunnock. Mrs. Falkiner, 2 sons and 2 daughters survive him. The second child of Otway and Sissy's was Mary Emily Falkiner, who was born in 1902 in Moama. She visited India at the age of 21 in 1923, and on the 18th of May 1932 she married Harold Weedon Benson in Victoria when she was 30 and Harold 32. She was from Lancashire in England. They had a son and a daughter, and they lived at Quirindi in New South Wales. Her husband died in 1953 and Mary died in 1973 on the 12th of September at Quirindi, aged 71. And Otway and Sissy's third child was Otway Maclaurin Falkiner, who was born on the 19th of April 1909 in Melbourne. He married Agnes Jeanette Cullen on the 18th of October 1935 in Toorak when he was 26 and Agnes 24. Otway Jr. was educated at Geelong Grammar School and then he became the director of F.S. Falkiner and Sons from 1934. He was a member of the Legislative Council in New South Wales from April 1946 and he managed Bunnock and the Wanganella Estate Studs. On the 15th of December 1954, Mexican divorce criticised in Sydney. Wealthy grazier and New South Wales MLC Otway Maclaurin Falkiner had, from his point of view, committed bigamy by going through a form of marriage in Mexico after getting a quick Mexican divorce from his Australian wife. Mr Justice McClemens described Falkiner's second wife as a cold, arrogant woman on whose oath I could place little reliance. Her son by previous marriage would only be harmed by contact with Falkiner and Falkiner's 4 children by a previous marriage. Mrs Beatrice Ann Falkiner of Potts Point, Sydney, sought access to her 12-year-old son. Her former husband was Patrick William Lang, a grazier of Cooma, New South Wales, who opposed the application. Lang was an honest, generous and upright man, said Justice McClemens, and that he'd adopted a perfectly proper attitude in refusing to allow his son to spend part of his Christmas holidays in contact with Falkiner and his 4 children. He said that he did not believe Mrs Falkiner's denial that she'd had an arrangement with Falkiner to marry him in Mexico before she left New South Wales. He varied an order allowing Mrs Falkiner access to her son, making it applicable only on condition that the child was not brought into contact with Falkiner or his children. Lang had divorced Mrs Falkiner for desertion in 1949 and she married Falkiner in Mexico in November 1953. And then an article on the 1st of March 1954 said the well-known grazier Mr Otway Maclaurin Falkiner, MLC, recently obtained a divorce in Mexico and was married on the same day to Mrs Betty Lang of Sydney. And then on the 18th of December 1854, New South Wales grazier sued for divorce. Mrs Agnes Jeanette Falkiner, 43 of Waganya, yesterday lodged a petition seeking a divorce from Otway Maclaurin Falkiner, 45, New South Wales grazier. Mrs Falkiner challenged the legality in Australia of a Mexican divorce her husband obtained last year, and she also challenges the position of Mrs Beatrice Falkiner as Mr Otway Falkiner's present wife by petitioning for divorce on the grounds of her husband's adultery with Beatrice Lang. Mrs Lang married Falkiner in Mexico on November the 17th last year after the Mexican divorce. The Falkiners were married at St John's Church of England at Toorak on the 11th of October 1935. There are 4 children of whom Mrs Falkiner asked custody and all are still at school. Mr Falkiner has resigned his position of manager of Bunnock Station for the company of F.S. and Falkiner and Sons Proprietary Limited, which he was a director and shareholder. It is alleged that Falkiner went to Mexico in 1953 and sent his wife divorce papers in Spanish. He then went through a form of marriage with another woman. Mrs Falkiner said that she was in debt and would need at least £15,000 and £40 a week to set herself up again. In 1953, Falkiner told his wife he was going on a tour of America and South America to study sheep breeding. The next Mrs Falkiner heard, she got a notice from a Melbourne firm of solicitors that they had divorce papers to give her. They indicated that her husband had gotten a Mexican divorce on the grounds of incompatibility of temperament. Falkiner brought his new wife home and Mrs Falkiner was subsequently asked to leave Bunnock Station and to find a home for herself and her 4 children. Wealthy grazier Otway Maclaurin Falkiner, 46, and Mrs Agnes Jean Falkiner, 44, today settled their differences on undisclosed terms out of court. Mrs Falkiner of East Malvern had sued her husband, who lives at Bunnock Stud, New South Wales, for maintenance. Falkiner had left her without means of support on November the 21st. And Otway died on the 20th of March 2000 at Rutherglen, aged 90. Otway and Una's firstborn was Laura Rothwell Falkiner. She was born on the 1st of December 1911 in Armidale, Victoria. She went to London at the age of 24 in 1935, and it seems across 1935 through 1937 she did quite a bit of travelling. She then married Colonel John Mansell Bruce Steer in Toorak on the 31st of August 1939 when she was 27 and John was 41. John was the only son of Mrs. T. Bruce Steer of Lidstep, Minehead, Somerset, England, and the late Captain Bruce Steer. An article in February 1941 says Mrs. John Mansell Bruce Steer, who since her marriage last year has been living in India, arrived in Melbourne about 2 weeks ago. While her husband, Colonel Bruce Steer, is on active service abroad with Punjab Regiment, she'll make a home with her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Otway Falkiner at Bunnock. And she died on the 23rd of August 1999 at Mona Vale, New South Wales, aged 87. They had no children. The 10th child of Frank and Emily Falkiner was Ralph Sadler Stoney Falkiner, who was born on the 20th of October 1877 in Corio, Victoria. He married Claire Emily Graham in November 1900 in Victoria when he was 23 and Claire 20. And it says the marriage of Ralph Sadler Falkiner, fourth son of Mr. F.S. Falkiner of Bunnock, New South Wales, and Miss Claire Graham, eldest daughter of Mr. Edward Graham of Royal Park, was celebrated at St Michael's Church, Princess Hill. They had 4 children, and in the Melbourne Australiasian on the 1st of November 1913, it outlines the Falkiner divorce suit. In the Sydney Divorce Court on October the 24th, Mr. Justice Gordon heard a suit in which Claire Emily Falkiner, formerly Graham, petitioned for a divorce from Ralph Sadler Stoney Falkiner. The grounds of the suit were allegations of misconduct with Doris Fraser between the 5th of October 1910 and the 1st of June 1913, whilst on a voyage between Melbourne and Marseille and at various places in Europe and at Melbourne. The parties were married at Carlton in Melbourne on the 14th of November 1900, according to the rites of the Church of England. The petitioner said that her husband was a member of the Falkiner family who owned large areas of grazing country in the Riverina. He had an income of about £12,000 a year. She had never seen nor heard the name of the correspondent until her youngest child was a week old. Her husband visited her that evening and admitted that he had spent the day motoring with 2 single girls, one of whom was Miss Doris Fraser. It was because her baby was too young that she did not accompany her husband to England when he went away for 6 months in September 1910. While he was away, petitioner was made aware of her husband's association with Miss Fraser. Subsequent inquiries disclosed that he'd lived with Miss Fraser in several places as man and wife, and that 2 children have been born and registered, with the respondent given as the father. Continuing her story, the petitioner said that she had ceased to live with her husband as soon as she found out these facts, but had allowed him to visit the children in the hope that his infatuation would die out and that he would return to his and her children and take up his position in the world as their father. He had repeatedly urged her to divorce him because he said he wished to marry Miss Fraser and legitimise her children. Victorian birth certificates were produced showing the registration of these 2 children. It was stated by Mr. Ralston for the petitioner that the respondent would continue to make an allowance of £2,000 a year to the petitioner and that negotiations were also proceeding for the arrangement of settlement upon the children. So Doris Fraser gave birth to Falkiner in St Kilda in 1911 and then Travers Philfera Falkiner on the 2nd of May 1913. Ralph then married Doris Fraser on the 10th of June 1914 when he was 36 and Doris 29, and they had a further 4 children together. Bill Sadler Falkiner in St Kilda in 1914, Doris Falkiner in 1916, Fraser Falkiner in 1919, and Patrick Sadler Falkiner in 1921. Ralph died on the 24th of May 1946 in Melbourne, and his obituary reads, Mr. Ralph Falkiner, Director of F.S. Falkiner and Sons Limited, died on Friday and was 68. Mr. Falkiner was a member of one of the pioneer sheep breeding families of Australia, the pastoral business of which he was director, conducted 2 of Australia's key merino stud properties, Bunnock and Wanganella Estate at Carnargo, New South Wales. For some years he managed another of the company stations, Moonbury, but resigned the position when he became interested in the manufacture of machinery. He invented the Falkiner cane harvester, which is used extensively in Queensland, the US and Cuba. He also introduced electricity into sheep shearing. Mr. Falkiner owned several large estates in Victoria and New South Wales, and is survived by a widow, 5 sons and 2 daughters. Mr. Falkiner was a keen member of picnic racing in the Riverina. When managing Moonbury, a 100,000-acre property, it was no small task for a young man, but he accomplished that was all asked of him. Another responsibility he had to shoulder was the first secretaryship of the family organisation when it was launched under the name of F.S. Falkiner and Sons Limited. Ralph was the third son to pass on after being actively associated with the management of the firm as a shareholder and director for many years. Back in his boyhood days, Ralph developed a penchant for engineering and he often gave a hand at his blacksmith's work on the firm stations. Later he became associated with Mr. Paul Boll in the invention of the first electric shearing machines produced in Australia, which bore the joint name of Falkiner-Boll. Mr. Falkiner conceived the idea of the adaptation of electric power to shearing machines, and he discussed the subject with Mr. Boll, who was an electrician, so impressively that he finally induced him to visit Germany and obtain a requisite type of small independent motor, now used in shearing sheds in all parts of the Commonwealth. There are probably few who are aware that Mr. Ralph and Mr. Lee Falkiner were mainly instrumental in maintaining the electric light service when they formed the Town Lighting and Power Company. They bought the franchise of another wheat concern which threatened to collapse and leave Deniliquin in the dark. Another invention of Mr. Falkiner was the cane cutting machine. He spent years in perfecting this harvester and visited every part of the world where sugarcane is extensively grown in efforts to improve the machine and sell the manufacturing rights. It was a huge task involving much time and costly travelling, but he lived to see the machine used in many countries. In days when cars were novel, scarce and costly, Mr. Falkiner bought and drove his own vehicle. There were no competent mechanics or garages, so Mr. Falkiner applied his own intimate knowledge of machinery. He later became a partner with the late Mr. C.B. Callow in establishing the highly successful car sales and service organisation named Callow, Falkiner and Company. After a few years he disposed of his interest to his partner, leaving the original firm name to denote his association with it. Mr. Falkiner gave up active management of family stations some years ago, and he speculated in pastoral properties. He acquired Melville Forest in southwest Victoria, which he held for some years, and then sold it to the Victorian government. He purchased the well-known Grungle station near Carrathul, and then he became associated with Mr. Ben Chafee in controlling the outsized Western leases known as Manfred and Kilfra. It is understood he was also a partner with Mr. Chafee in some very big transactions in sheep. Mr. Falk and went to England to live for years. When he returned, his headquarters were in William Street, Melbourne, and he usually lived in Melbourne. Only those who knew the deceased gentleman well recognised him as a great humanitarian and could thoroughly appreciate his kindly disposition and his keen regard for old friendships. Deniliquin and district had a very high place in his esteem, as the town was where he spent his boyhood days, and in later years of a busy life he always enjoyed his visits here. Ralph's children with Claire Graham. The firstborn was Jenny Falkiner. She was born in January 1903 in North Carlton. She married Lucius O'Brien John Connolly on the 29th of January 1929 in Victoria when she was 26 and Lucius 32. They departed for England in 1932. They had 3 children, but only one boy survived infancy. Jenny and Lucius divorced in February 1945. Jenny Connolly, née Falkiner, 41 of Macedon, sought a decree nisi for a divorce from Lucius O'Brien John Connolly, 47 AIF captain. Mrs. Connolly alleged that her husband had been guilty of repeated acts of adultery with Marjorie Nall of Parramatta, New South Wales. Mrs. Connolly requested custody of their only child, Nicholas, aged 5. Jenny then married Frank Wood Goldie in Collins Street, Melbourne on the 19th of December 1946 when she was 43. And an article said that after their marriage, Mr. and Mrs. Goldie will visit Montreal and Scotland before they settle in Bombay. The bridegroom is a Canadian and is with a Canadian assurance company which also operates in India. And a news item in the Sydney Sunday Herald on the 5th of November 1950 said Mrs. Jenny Falkiner of Bunnock Station, Deniliquin, has Saxony running in the Melbourne Cup. And a social note in the Adelaide Mail on the 16th of February 1952 said that Mrs. Ellen McFarlane arrived in Melbourne from South Africa, and she said one of the highlights of her visit was a trip through Carco to Cape Town where she stayed with Mrs. Peter Goldie, formerly Jenny Falkiner of Melbourne. And Jenny died on the 16th of June 1962 at Cape Town, South Africa, and she's buried in Deniliquin Cemetery with her parents. The second child was Frank Sadler Falkiner. He was born on the 26th of July 1905 in North Carlton. He married Leila Patricia Forsyth on the 24th of October 1935 at Wallara, New South Wales, when he was 30 and Leila was 20. They lived at Tooma in New South Wales and owned a property called The Park. And Frank died on the 17th of April 1998 in Southport, Queensland at the age of 92. It seems they didn't have children. The next child, Ralph Sadler Falkiner. was born in 1910 in St Kilda, and he died only at the age of 12 on the 12th of April 1922 in Melbourne. And the youngest child of Ralph Falkiner and Claire Graham was Beatrice Falkiner. She was born in 1911 in St Kilda. The firstborn child of Ralph and Doris Fraser was Travis Kilfear Falkiner. He was born on the 2nd of May 1913 in St Kilda. He married Nora Deirdre Dalton on the 7th of June in 1946 in Melbourne, and Deirdre was the youngest daughter of the late Mr Mick Dalton and Mrs Dalton of Orange, and it stated that Travers was the assistant manager of Moonbury. They had a son and a daughter, and then he married Margaret Cully, and Travers died in Deniliquin on the 2nd of August 1994 at the age of 81. The second child, Bill Sadler Falkiner, was born on the 12th of October 1914 in St Kilda. He married Irma Ada Thompson in 1946 in Victoria, and they had 5 children. By 1949 they were living in Queensland, where Bill was working as a secretary, and Bill died in 2002 in Queensland aged 88. Doris Falkiner was born on the 6th of September 1916 in Melbourne. She married David Allen Cook, and she died on the 14th of August 1996 at the age of 79 in Victoria. The fourth child was Fraser Falkiner, known as Jum. He was born on the 6th of September 1919 in Melbourne. He married Betty Amy Livingston Heafy at Wallara on the 30th of May 1946 when he was 26. At the time of their marriage, he was a flight lieutenant in the RAAF. He received the nickname Jum, short for Jumbo. There was a recollection in 1995 where Mr Falkiner spoke at an Anzac ceremony, and he said that he was a Spitfire pilot and was shot down in flames near Calais on the 27th of October 1941, and he spent his first 5 months of captivity in hospital being treated for severe burns. He spent 3.5 years of his 4 years abroad in a German prison camp. He met his wife during his RAAF training days in Sydney. He was a grazier at Bunnock. Betty and Fraser had 3 children. Fraser married Miss Anita O'Donovan, daughter of Mr and Mrs H.J. Donovan of Balgowlah, and they married at St John's Church in Toorak and said that they would live at the Wanganella estate, and that was in September 1964. Fraser died on the 17th of September 2007 in Victoria at the age of 88. And Ralph Sadler Falkiner's youngest son, Patrick Sadler Falkiner, was born in 1921 in Victoria. He married Madge Margaret Sturgis in 1953 in Victoria. He died on the 1st of May 1992 at the age of 71, and they had no children. And the youngest child, Lee Sadler Falkiner, was born on the 2nd of February 1880 in Geelong. He married Beatrice Lyle Young at the Christchurch in South Yarra on the 14th of November 1914 when he was 34 and Beatrice 20. Miss Beatrice Lyle Young is the younger daughter of Mr and Mrs R.E. Young of Therese, Orong Road, Toorak, and Bull Plains of Corowa. And it says that they left for Sydney on their honeymoon, and they left the Oriental in a perfect deluge of confetti in red, white and blue colourings, and on their return they'll reside at Wanganella Estate. They had 3 children together, and Lee died on the 6th of June 1952 in South Yarra. The Riverine Grazier, the Hay newspaper, outlined his death. Death has removed another member of a pioneer pastoral family in the person of Lee Sadler Falkiner, who died in Melbourne on Monday, aged 72. He was the youngest of the 5 sons of Mr and Mrs Franc Sadler Falkiner of Bunnock Station. As a young man, he managed Wanganella Estate. For many years, he was secretary of the family organisation of F.S. Falkiner and Sons Limited. For some years, with his brother, he ran the Deniliquin Electricity Undertaking under franchise. When Mr Falkiner lived in Deniliquin, he was president of the Conago Shire Council, the SR Picnic Race Club and the Deniliquin Jockey Club. Keenly interested in racing in his earlier days, he raced with pronounced success and annexed the Gold Cup on 2 occasions. He is survived by a widow and 2 daughters. His only son, Lee, was killed while serving in the RAF in the last war. It was in memory of Lee Falkiner Jr. and John Falkiner, son of Mr and Mrs Otway Falkiner, Bunnock North, that the firm of F.S. Falkiner and Sons donated land to the CSIRO known as the Falkiner Memorial Field Station. And that field station my great-uncle managed for quite a few years, Gordon Marr. Lee and Beatrice Falkner's children. The firstborn was Beatrice Louisa Falkiner, who was known as Anne. She was born on the 5th of November 1915 in South Yarra. In June 1949, her engagement was announced in the paper. Miss Beatrice Ann Falkiner, elder daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Lee Falkiner of South Yarra, has become engaged in Bombay, India, to Lieutenant Colonel P. Simmons, an Englishman, formerly of the Buffs. Miss Falkiner left Melbourne in April to spend a holiday with her married sister in Bombay. Her mother joined her there at the end of last month. The wedding will take place soon in India. She married Peter Simmons on the 23rd of June 1949 in Bombay, India, at the age of 33. Peter was 30. They had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, and Beatrice died on the 23rd of September 2001 in South Yarra at the age of 85. Their second child was Joan Alice Falkiner. She was born on the 16th of September 1917 at their home Fairley House in South Yarra. Joan attended Heathfield Girls' School in England for 5 years from the age of 12. Joan had met Tali Muhammad Khan in the Black Forest in Germany in 1937 when he was seeking treatment for a painful polo injury. Joan was living in Freiburg with her mother and her sister Anne and happened to be staying in the same hotel as him, and it was there that Nawab first saw her and fell in love. When he and Joan met, she was 19 and he was 55. Joan's family objected to the relationship. Tali, as a Muslim, was already married to an Indian woman who had since become an invalid, and he had a 20-year-old son and a daughter. However, in 1939, Joan eloped and travelled to India to marry Tali. The departure of the 21-year-old heiress caused a stir and much speculation in Melbourne high society. She married Lieutenant Colonel His Highness Subdat Ulmu Palanpur, so Tali Muhammad Palanpur, whose birth name was Nawab Tali Khan, in Bombay, India on the 14th of September 1939 at the age of 21. He was 56. And an excerpt from an article says, in 1939, young Joan Falkiner's spirited flight from South Yarra to princely India and her marriage to the already married Muslim ruler of a small northwestern state of Gujarat sent shockwaves through Melbourne society and political reverberations through the Raj and the highest reaches of the British government. She converted to Islam. Though recognised as such by Tali, she was denied the title of Begum by the British Raj, which disapproved of marriages between Anglo women and Indian rulers. Joan was also not invited by the British to appear beside her husband during public functions. The couple had one child, a daughter that they named Shamim Sultana. She was born on the 6th of February 1943, and she was known as H.H. Jahanara Begum Sahiba of Palanpur. She was educated in England at the same boarding school as her mother. In 1947, India became independent, and this meant the end of the British Raj title. On the night of the 14th of August 1947, the last Viceroy of India, Lord Louis Mountbatten, decided to confer a title of nobility on Joan. She was known as Her Highness Jahan Ara Begum of Palanpur, allowing her to claim the title of Her Highness in British eyes. However, Indian independence led to the dissolution of the Palanpur state. Her husband died on the 20th of May 1957. After Tali's death, Joan settled in southern France with their daughter, and she died in Nambour, Queensland in September 2003 at the age of 85, and she is buried with the family at Deniliquin Cemetery. And as mentioned, Lee Brereton Sadler Falkiner, the youngest child, he went to war. He was born on the 11th of June 1921 in Armidale, and he died on the 12th of February 1942 in Kidlington, Oxfordshire, England, at the age of only 20. His death was recorded in the Deniliquin Pastoral Times. Air accident causes death. Lee Brereton Sadler Falkiner, RAF, has died as a result of an air accident in England. He was the only son of Mr. and Mrs. Lee Falkiner of South Yarra and formerly of Wanganella Estate, Deniliquin. He was educated at Geelong Grammar School. So the Falkiner family coming from very little to Australia, it was certainly a success story, and it seems that his family members did a very good job in running a family business so well and amassing such a great fortune and having such influence in the sheep breeding industry in Australia.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.